Visitors weren't allowed to take photos. Cameras of the day were too big and bulky to sneak into the fair, and the photo ban was strictly enforced, which is why you rarely see photos not taken by an official fair photographer. Construction of the buildings began as the groundwork was still in progress, and throughout 1891, the Venetian landscape of the White City began to emerge from the mud of Jackson Park. In 18 months of working around the clock, the carpenters, bricklayers, painters, and plasterers raised every building and sculpted every statue on the fair site. What was truly remarkable about the main buildings was not just the designs, but the techniques developed to build them. The Colombian Guard, the official police force for the fair, spent much of their time watching for errant photographers, where the newspapers of the world all had correspondents to tell the story for the folks back home.
Welcome to Old World Discovery Channel. I'm your host, Douglas. Episode 2 of Season 1 on this channel.
This is going to be such an exciting day. I hope you enjoy it. I think you will.
Today we're going to look at vanilla skies. Now, this is a phrase I coined when examining old photos in 2018 when I began looking at photos myself with respect to mystery history and investigation in the videos that I did on my YouTube channel called UAP, after seeing Martin Liedtke's work on his channel. Now, these skies that I called vanilla skies, I also called Miller skies. I had noticed first that the painted-on flags were atop the buildings in an obviously manipulated, hand-animated or painted depiction on a photograph. Now, these are photographs that are presented as being historic, and in many cases they're showing the old world as we are discovering on this channel. I began to see such anomalies as these, and furthermore unnaturally cropped edges, and began to realize it wasn't just overexposures of light, but purposeful film exposures or masking during darkroom development, perhaps, and other types of manipulations. Now, this can be acceptable and there can be good reasons for this, but when we're talking about supposedly historical depictions, it makes one wonder. And the purpose of looking into this today is not to see whether or not this was done with any kind of motivation one way or another, but to find what could possibly have been there that was hidden and what would it mean. Now, sometimes in these supposed historical depictions, buildings were not being shown that were there. I also noticed that the horizon wasn't level when taken from another angle or another photo of the same angle, same elevation, all other things being equal. In other photographs, distant ground exists, but in certain photographs, that distant ground or horizon had been replaced with a white or blank vanilla-looking sepia sky. They use the color sepia a lot. And there may be some kind of a psychological reason for that, perhaps nefarious, but we don't know that. It's not our purpose here to look into motivations as much as what we find interesting about the old world that was hidden in history. And this is a mystery of history that we seek to uncover. Now, it is important sometimes to know who selected or commissioned these photos. Oftentimes in early photography, there was just one single official photographer as a named source for documenting entire regions or events or times. Now, prior to the year 2020, this is being recorded, it's almost 2023 now, this narrative had been unchanged, but since 2020, in the past 3 years, I've seen personally that this narrative has been changed. One example is Matthew Brady being responsible for the United States official photography for quite a while, his name being synonymous with nearly all photography during the American Civil War, being responsible for documenting this Civil War of the 1860s in the United States. Another example is Roger Fenton of Great Britain and his work in the Crimean region with respect to the Crimean War. These individuals were selected at very young ages for such major responsibilities as being the named single responsible sources for all photo evidence in the very beginning of photographic history. Now, the narrative has changed, being that instead of these individuals being solely responsible for so much, now it's being said that just their names were used and many other people were involved. Now, that's more believable, but that wasn't part of the official narrative until just the past 3 or so years, since we as a community have been bringing this up, such as on the channel Autodidactic, Campbell, and others. Now, on the one hand, it perhaps makes sense that individuals selected to have these high responsibilities with this newer technology would be selected at such young ages, although it had been already many decades old. Here in the beginning of photographic history, not very many people necessarily would have been skilled or capable of making so many photos of such important things. Well, the age of photography was already, like I said, several, if not 3 or even 4 decades old in these cases, at least 2 decades old. And there were many more private individuals that should or would have had access to photographic equipment and been able to use this technology probably more than anyone in government employment. Yet we do not see unadulterated, privately taken photographs by citizens. One could say it makes sense in war that that wouldn't have been possible. But likewise, if you look at photography of the World's Fairs, World Expositions, again, it follows logically that if these events were happening exactly as presented and there was freedom and many people other than official government photographers would have had access to photographic equipment, and certainly by the 1880s, 1890s, that had been 50 years, well, there would have been many photos produced by citizens, many times more produced by citizens than the officials. If you think of present day, in any single day at Disney World, for example, how many tens of thousands of photos are taken by private individuals? Now, it's not exactly comparable, the ease to which one could take photos, but back then, there were handheld cameras. In fact, the only explanation for these World's Fairs and Expositions having only photographs available from official photographers is censorship. And, in fact, it's well known and reported officially that censorship did take place in those cases, at least with the Columbian Exposition of 1893. There certainly was censorship of photography. It was policed very heavily. Photographic equipment, cameras, while they could be taken in handheld at the time, even in 1893 it was possible, these artificial restrictions and very strict censorship rules prevented that. So, as it is, in many other instances, for various reasons, what we find is nearly all available photos throughout the entirety of the 1800s are existing only from a very few sources. Not as few as previously stated with examples of Roger Fenton and Matthew Brady, but close. Even with the adjusted narrative today, still, either way you look at it, nearly all available photos throughout the 1800s are from official government-sponsored photographers, especially when you're talking about wars, technologies, photographs of prominent individuals, unsettled regions, public events, expositions, of course, and newsworthy events, all published by officials affiliated with governmental funding and oversight. So when we find things like these vanilla skies, as I called them, these are markers or indicators of there being a certain state of presentation of a designated or designed reality for people to accept. It's tagged, it's serialized, it's a planned out and carefully orchestrated experience about the past for people of the present and the future. And we really have to search for any clues as wise observers to figure out what kinds of rules and limitations were set in place when these documents, in this case photographic evidence, came into existence. It may indicate what kind of objective there was and what are the really important things that remain unseen, and perhaps what remains visible and seen could have some sort of a code or a combination for us to unlock to have a better understanding of the reality. Whether or not it's very interesting when we get there, or if anything was done intentionally, clearly there is some kind of a script in place guiding the experience that we're presented. Sometimes it's thought that this society, this world that we know, is more of an island reality than just a realm. Oftentimes we do rightly, I think, believe or see ourselves in the center of it all in a very special time with great understanding, great knowledge and access to that knowledge, and have no reason to suspect that anything needs to be stamped out or tagged or highlighted or diminished. We think that when we search through information that it comes up by pure randomness of our own preferences. But when we start to notice that things are tailored and custom made and manipulated, perhaps we can look a little bit deeper and see if there's anything directly proportional in what we see modified to any sort of significance of reality or artificiality being there. Now, the World's Fairs themselves do fascinate me personally, and they seem to be somewhat fluid across the whole spectrum of everything between explainable to the heights of surreality. And the extent that history fails to make any sense about some of those more surreal aspects presents perhaps sometimes the most ludicrous and comic ways of anybody ever trying so hard to explain anything and failing. When they don't make any sense about some aspects that are presented, even in the most ludicrous explanations, because they're trying hard to convince people, they somehow manage to do it, because so many people find nothing wrong with swallowing everything that's given to them, despite any kind of critical thinking presenting the most opposite of common sense and logic to even the most loose and base among them at the skill of critical thinking. But the approach of authority works almost every time. Some of the official presentations, specifically talking about the World's Fairs and World Expositions, seem to almost try to debase and mock the public in the way of highlighting their lack of critical thinking and the fact that these presentations are going to go over. One of the best examples of this, again, is the 1893 Columbian Exposition. There was a video documentary presentation that was narrated by Gene Wilder. On my channel UAP, I spoofed this and had great fun.
In the shape of a mammoth boat, rowed by figures of classical allegories, symbolizing Columbus's discovery of the New World. Two other fountains flanking the administration building held a special surprise for later.
Yes!
Watching the original show is easy enough to be some good comedy for any of those of you who are like me, who are able to see the lengths that they go to sell some of the more surreal aspects of history as it's presented. And the use of a comedic actor who also played Dr. Frankenstein in Mel Brooks' movies, also Willy Wonka, to do that is a tremendously prescient choice, if you ask me.
At the other end of the basin rose a looming statue symbolizing the American Republic. A robed woman 65 feet high, crowned with laurel leaves and holding up an orb in one hand.
But hurry, please. We have so much time and so little to see.
Now, if there is anybody behind this with a purpose or an intent in doing it, I'm sure that they had some good laughs. Because most of the people who watch it imagine themselves as existing independent and autonomous with free will to make all kinds of decisions based on such presentations of history of the world as they know it, without giving it much of a second thought. Now, the theme in all these early photographs of history seems to be so much about war. And the theme of war seems to be so much about technology. And at the root of all of that, they say, is politics. Now, in school, most of us, if not all of us, were taught that history is truly as presented, and everything that matters in shaping the world becomes history. And it's the politics and the technology and the wars that determine who's controlling the land, who's guiding the civilization, whose interventions and whose political power are tied to which people groups, men and women, either good or evil, oftentimes seen in a dialectic, such as Hitler being bad and Thomas Edison being good. Oftentimes they highlight greatness of some individuals, and there's a narrative or a tale that goes along with the greatness, often involves sacrifice and oftentimes even destruction. I have no doubt that real conflicts did occur to some extent, at least diplomatically. These things were postured, troops were amassed, there were bangs and booms in evacuated cities, and the evidence of destruction of these cities and the architecture within is undeniable. What's behind it, literally in the photographs and figuratively in the motivations and events, are as far off in some cases as the horizon itself, even the high seas. It does seem that war was conducted for dominance, about trade routes, about the open seas, or even local civil wars in defense of or against native populations. Ostensibly, many of these were conducted originally or in the past by corporations, sometimes crowns, hierarchies, until around World War I. And now they say that corporations are not conducting the wars, and there is no overarching hierarchy or crown above the elected rulers. But until World War I, there were quite a few of officially independent kingdoms and khanates, specifically involving Tartaria, to a greater extent, I think, than we've been taught or led to believe. But these higher numbers of independent kingdoms were reduced dramatically. Even among the native populations, if you look at it one way, these were also little kingdoms, smaller crowns or khanates of a different variety, but politically and for many other ways of analysis exactly the same, also overtaken and either completely wiped out in the case of Tasmania, or introduced or folded in, assimilated to whatever country, corporation, or crown dominated them. Now, what is the extent and what was the power of these independent kingdoms before they had been usurped? Not so long ago, perhaps long ago. How long this greater war has been going on, we don't know. We've seen much of the architecture of these civilizations matching around the world, all over the world. Greco architecture is, to the largest extent, existing outside of Greece. Roman architecture, the greatest percentage, in the high 90s of all Roman architecture in percentage-wise, exists outside of Rome. We're told that it was built later, it was influenced by Rome, but do we know that? We can't really see that through much of an objective lens going back in time. What if we looked at things from a reverse angle? Just like knowing that the vanilla skies are not blank and that there was something there. What would it be? Well, in some cases we've seen glorious architecture in the place of the blank nothingness. Well, what if the native populations were the civilized crowns? What if the so-called unaffiliated independent kingdoms were affiliated? Is that perhaps the great Tartary? And had that not been usurped long ago, would their independence produce the type of architecture and lifestyle that we see evident in what's being destroyed all over the world to a much larger extent? Because we don't know how much has been destroyed if it was properly destroyed before we even had a chance to look at it. Definitely in the early photographs, there was censorship going on for a reason. Now, this was done long enough to destabilize and subjugate the remnants of the former republics, whose history could be almost completely wiped out. But maybe there was a larger world system, and maybe it was a better system. Certainly going by the architecture, one could ask the question. And I wonder, since they destroyed the architecture with no good reason, it's been done in the city in which I live, in Toledo, Ohio, in the USA. Really great old world buildings were destroyed in the past 60 years. That is well known. And for what? For parking lots in some cases. Well, does the architecture itself pose some kind of a threat? There's so many questions that can be asked. And that's what we're going to do on this channel as we continue. Stay tuned for more.